The spy now turns to the analysis of Fromm and Fuller, former Bill Clinton advisor Al Fromm and former Reagan and Bush White House aide Craig Fuller. Nice to see you all. Craig, let me start with you. On Monday, the president, along with his Attorney General William Barr, used both police and National Guard troops to physically clear out demonstrators in Lafayette Park, right across from the White House, so that a photo op could be taken of the president in front of St. John's Church holding a Bible. Is there any rationale for that kind of strategy?
I really don't see one. I think you have to go to the possibility that he simply had too much pressure from his core supporters and felt he had to go out and be heard. But I think what you have here is an act that helps little with certainly those who oppose President Trump. I don't think it helped at all with those who might be undecided, and it might have even concerned some of his supporters. One White House aide actually saying he was ashamed of what had happened in this event. You know, I think it signals another problem, and that is that the White House staff simply is unable to understand the consequences of these kinds of events and actions, and they take a great deal of heat and do very little good. And President Trump's approval ratings are now down to 44% overall, according to today's Rasmussen poll. But interestingly enough, 44% of the voters strongly disapprove of the way Trump is handling things. And so these events are actually weakening his presidency, not helping it, but they do not seem able to understand that. They're at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Al, could you chime in?
I agree with Craig. I don't see any legitimate rationale in using American troops to attack American citizens who are peacefully exercising their constitutional right the only purpose of doing that is for a photograph. It's morally wrong. It undermines our democracy. I mean, to me, it's something you'd expect from Putin or Xi, who Trump admires, and not from an American president. And I also agree with what Craig said about the politics. It's misguided politics. I'm sure Trump believes that he's going to benefit with his hard white base. But, you know, just by showing strength, whether it's real strength or in this case, pretty phony strength. But, you know, 30 years ago when Craig and I were engaged, about 10 or 12% of the electorate were people of color. And divisive racial politics may have worked from time to time. But today, the country's diverse. It's one of our strengths. I think you're seeing that in the people who are protesting. And people of color are going to make up about 30% of the electorate. So I believe this politics of racial division will be routed this year. You know, one of my favorite quotes in politics comes from FDR at his Commonwealth Club speech in 1932, where he said, "New conditions impose new requirements on government and those who conduct government." In other words, if you're going to be a leader, you got to change with the times, and you got to adapt to new circumstances. President Trump seems to have a hard time getting out of the past, and he needs to start talking to the America of today and tomorrow.
Sticking with you, Al, if you wouldn't mind, another political development this week, one of Joe Biden's significant candidates for running mate, Amy Klobuchar, was heavily criticized. I guess she had an opportunity to prosecute this rogue cop in 2006. I could have had my dates wrong, but this has really put her candidacy in jeopardy. And I wonder if she can survive that kind of scrutiny, or does Biden have to move on and look at other candidates?
I think he's probably going to have to move on. Now, full disclosure, Amy Klobuchar has been my candidate.
That's why I asked you.
I like her a lot. I think she'd be a great vice president and would bring important political strengths to Vice President Biden. But I just said that new conditions change, new circumstances change. Your leaders have to change with that. And the George Floyd murder is a new circumstance, and it's really brought out a sore in the country in such a vivid way. I mean, I think that's what's different between this occurrence and other recent problems with police brutality. To me, it's critical for Biden that this be a referendum on Trump. And if he picked Senator Klobuchar, she'd be an issue. And it would allow Trump to divert away from his own record on the virus, on the economy, and on social justice. So I think Vice President Biden is probably going to look elsewhere.
Craig, what's your thought?
I kind of agree with that. I will say that the choice really needs to be considered in terms of who is going to help him the most in the September-October timeframe before the November election. And we've got a long ways to go. So one issue, one action at this stage does not necessarily become disqualifying. Having said that, it certainly feels where we sit today that the kinds of issues that are being discussed, the racial divide, the economic inequalities that exist today, are going to be part of this campaign. And I, for one, have thought that Kamala Harris would be a strong choice as vice president for Biden. Frankly, I think he would be well advised to energize his campaign a little bit and announce his choice now and announce that the person is going to lead some kind of a group of people to look at just what his administration would do on day one to really deal with some of the issues that are being identified. And in that context, I think Kamala Harris is an interesting choice from the standpoint that she has obvious ties to the Black community. She's also been in law enforcement as an attorney general and brings a lot to the table. It goes to this question, which I think we spoke about last week, of just what role does Biden play? And I do think Biden's voice has to become more visible in these discussions. And I know he's traveled some, but if he's going to become known as somebody who's ready to address today's problems and not just rest on the works of the last few decades in government, I think he has to be out front. I think he has to show the kinds of people he would surround himself by. And making an early vice presidential choice, I think, might advantage his campaign. Not that they're taking advice from me on this, of course.
And finally, Craig, it looks like the president is following through on his threat to pull out of Charlotte. The North Carolina governor, who happens to be Democrat, has said that there will probably be restrictions on social distancing, and so Trump has let out the word that he's looking for another place. Is that possible? Can you pull that off?
This is kind of a political version of these cruise ships that were traveling around trying to find some port that would allow them to disembark their passengers. I just think it's foolhardy. We have moved away. I saw one reference to the need for a space that would allow 50,000 people to gather. Of course, he wants the biggest convention of anybody's in the recent history, I guess. But where are 50,000 people going to be found who want to be in close proximity together? And why would you do that to the very people you need to count on to be turning out to vote in September and October? So I think this is one of those things where you might, wish something could happen, but that doesn't necessarily make it happen. I suspect that when we get into the summer, people are going to continue to refrain from wanting to be in large gatherings. And those that, cast aside the sort of rational concern are going to run some real risk. I've really been a believer, and I wrote a piece for The Spy about there's an obligation to protect. And communities and mayors and convention centers are not going to want to take actions that are putting people at risk. And you'd think that the National Party would feel the same way. We'll see how this comes out. My guess is it's going to be a slimmed down version of a convention held somewhere in America, maybe on a cruise ship. You never know.
Al?
I can never figure out what President Trump wants to do politically. I mean, he obviously loves the story, and he gets his one-day story. But unfortunately, the one-day story isn't going to last until November. I don't see any advantage in pulling the convention from a swing state. I mean, the convention's already lost for Charlotte because all the money they're going to make from having a gazillion people come in is going to be lost because people aren't coming. So he's not really punishing. The city may just reduce some of its expenses for that matter. But both conventions are going to be likely going to be virtual conventions. I can't help, back to one of my old experiences with Craig Fuller, I can't help recalling the first line of my book, which was, on election night 1980, I had a party and nobody came. And the reason I had that party and nobody came was because Fuller and his Reagan team just routed us. And we lost the White House, we lost the Senate. Every one of my friends who I'd invited to the party had lost his or her job. And I have the same feeling about these conventions. With the pandemic in most states banning mass gatherings, if there are conventions, nobody's going to want to go.
Hey, I do also want to ask at the last minute something that came up earlier today. The Secretary of Defense went out of his way to make it clear that he did not want military intervention in any of these cities that are going through some disruptions. From what I see from the Trump administration, he has just shortened his lifespan considerably. But do you feel like that's the beginning of some kind of disruption in his cabinet?
I think it's a sign that it's a cabinet officer taking a stand based on very careful assessment of what the realities are. I suspect that he should have his resume ready, but it could be a sign that some of these people are going to step forward and stand for what they truly believe in. But it's a difficult thing to do in this administration, and your tenure is short-lived. Defense and state have been places where I think people have spoken with a little bit more candor, but we'll have to see how this plays out.
Al, any thoughts as we close up?
The American military is not trained to go to war with American citizens. They're trained to protect the rights of American citizens. And I mean, I hope it's the beginning of people standing up. I just watched this incredible thing on NBC of Casey Hunt talking to senators walking by, Republican senators, and without exception, basically they were afraid to criticize Trump for using the military on American citizens. But I hope this is a sign that maybe the military, I suspect that the reason the defense secretary, who's sort of a non-entity really, stepped up and said that is because he was under pressure from underneath in the Pentagon.
Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thanks guys.